So welcome everyone to Ecopsychology Café. This is a virtual forum for folks interested in ecopsychology and ecotherapy to discuss the relevant topics of our time. Hello, my name is Carol Koziel, and I'm the founder of the Canadian Ecopsychology Network, the host of this program. Monica Dragosz and I co-created this series. Now I'll turn things over to Monica, who will introduce herself, and we'll talk about today's theme, climate silence. Monica?
So I'm Monica, and I am a psychotherapist who's had a long-standing interest in ecopsychology. I'm just going to see if I can get this all bigger. It was just I just stumbled on the term climate silence one day on the internet, and I was just struck by the term. And I kind of wanted to call this climate silence in everyday life, because that's kind of where my interest went to with it. But climate silence, I think, can refer to everything from that macro level of politicians not talking about climate change adequately or enough in their election platforms and things like that, to the media picking it up when it's kind of convenient for them or there's nothing else to talk about, to the everyday, the ways that we don't talk about it even with one another or in our personal lives with the people closest to us. So I think that part of how I come to this is my recognition that even the field of psychology, which I've been part of, and mental health for a very long time, hasn't traditionally done a good job of talking about climate change. And just a personal example of this is I had this experience of being with coworkers, doing some consultations with each other, and we do personal check-in. That was the ritual that we had. And one day I was talking about my sense of my grief and my dread about the wildfire smoke that we were experiencing at the time. And when I was finished with what I was saying, I had one of my coworkers turn to me and say, it's not about the smog, Monica. She actually used the term smog. And so I think there's this really funny thing that's happened where psychology has used this notion of defensive strategies to ignore its own defensive strategies, and it accused other people of projecting, whereas plenty of folks within the field of psychology don't want to talk about climate change themselves. So it was kind of an interesting experience to have that. And I think part of what was interesting about that is that this was not somebody who is a climate denier per se, but just, I think, from what I know of my colleagues, so not talking about climate change, it's not part of her world, her everyday culture and conversations. So I think the thing is that in our lives, this sort of becomes this social taboo where this is something that we don't really bring up because no one wants to talk about it. And so we don't want to be that person who brings it up. And it becomes kind of the spiral of silence. I know that last time when we were talking about connecting people in place, there was a comment from someone in the group about how they don't want to be talking about climate change. Like, they don't want to have these conversations with people who are deniers, who have radically different opinions, that their own nervous system can't tolerate that kind of discussion. And, I was resonating with that, and that's not kind of where I was coming at this from today. I was really interested in the idea of how is it that we can talk more to each other in our everyday lives and the people closest to us about this? Because I've certainly been noticing in my life that there's even silence amongst, with my friends and the small family that I have, that we don't tend to talk about this. And it got me wondering a little bit about what the implications of this, the larger implications of that are. So the implications kind of just beyond our personal experience and feeling alienated and isolated or alone in some of our experiences with this, but what does it mean when we're not talking about it in the bigger picture? And this is a quote from Catherine Hayhoe, who is a climate scientist from this country that we refer to as Canada, who has an interesting background in that she's an evangelical Christian and a climate scientist, and now living in the US, in Texas, and teaching climate science, but has become a big advocate for how we talk about it. And I believe she wrote a book called Saving Us. And again, it's about the importance of talking about climate change. And she's, I think, become used to talking with people on the other side of the spectrum from her about climate change. But this quote here refers to just the shroud of silence around it in general. So she would say that the issue is not even the deniers or the skeptics. Like some of the statistics that I've seen her quote say that, the majority of people still believe that human caused climate change is real, and they acknowledge that. There might be something to be said for how much of a problem or how near to us people think it is. But, in this quote, she highlights that it's the complacency that we have around it that's the challenge. So as she says, studies have shown that not even 25% of the people in the US hear someone else talk about climate change more than once or twice a year. And so if we're sort of tempted to think that this isn't going to affect us personally in our lifetime, this kind of gets reinforced by the fact that no one is talking about it. So this is just kind of a doodle I did. This is me kind of trying to make sense of all of this, because part of the reason I wanted to talk about this, because I think it was a challenge to myself to even get better in my own life about talking to people closer to me about climate change. This is based on stuff I read from Renee Lertzman, who is somebody else who has talked a lot about climate change communications. And she's highlighted the fact that when people talk about what needs to be done about climate change, when experts weigh in on that, rarely is the emotional or affective, which is, sort of the clinical psychological term for it, the emotional or feeling component talked about. And yet that is what we're dealing with when we're talking about engaging people in an issue like climate change, is that on some level, we really need to kind of address that there is anxiety and fear. And that anxiety and fear can take different routes. You get people sort of say that the deniers and the skeptics, there's identity, there's issues of identity wrapped in that. So some of my little bubbles up there under anxiety and fear have to do with these different, I think, thought processes and emotional experiences that are still an offshoot of this basic anxiety that people are confronted with when confronted with the larger issue of climate change. And Renee Lertzman goes right back to kind of really basic psychoanalytic theory about the defensive strategies or the defense mechanisms that are evoked by an issue like this: denial, dissociation, projection, which is what my colleague was using on me, and I was feeling that she was having her own, of course, and splitting. So I believe she's going to be having a book coming out about all this as well. So I was just kind of musing on the fact that as we employ these different defensive strategies, and we all do it, and we all have to do it. It's not that this is like an issue that we can be with all the time, every moment of our lives. But the more that we're employing these mechanisms, the more we're kind of reinforcing that silence, that spiral of silence. So this is another quote from Jill Kubit, and she is founder of an organization called Dear Tomorrow, I believe. And she was motivated to start that when she became a parent and was confronted with the notion of trying to talk about this to her children. So if you're interested, you can look that up. But people share letters and messages to children and people in their lives about their fears and their worries about climate change and their hopes for the future. And so again, here she's talking about the importance of having conversations with people in your lives from the perspective of what matters to you. values. And the idea that when we do this, that we normalize the idea that climate change is the thing. We just sort of break down some of the barriers to talking about it and engaging with it. And so just in my swipe of the internet in general, I was kind of thinking about what I was reading from various people about what works and what doesn't. And I think there's still variation in opinion on this. So I kind of put generally in there. It was interesting to hear people say, and I think probably a lot of us know this already, that inundating people with facts about climate change really doesn't do much for their ability to really engage this as an issue or maybe even take action. Again, I think most people, they do believe that it's real and they acknowledge that, and they might understand the basic principles and the science behind it, which is really all that's needed. The other thing that it seems acknowledged that doesn't generally tend to work is really trying to invoke people's fears or trying to instill a lot of fear around this issue. And I put generally because I don't know that that is always universally true. And I know that some people think that at certain levels, and certainly at the level of government, the alarm really needs to be sounded on that. So what I could gather from some of the people, like even people, the quotes from Jill Kubit and Catherine Hayhoe and Renee Lertzman, the things that work are focusing on our values and speaking from the heart and acknowledging our fears. And I just was kind of musing on the fact that I think when it comes to our everyday conversations and the people in our lives, that these are things that are more within reach. So I think there might be a little bit of a difference between, you know, at a certain point in our conversations, acknowledging some of our fears and anxieties versus trying to scare each other. Addressing that whole, you know, affective or emotional component. This photograph is interesting because it was taken by someone named TJ Watt, and I believe he refers to himself as a conservation photographer. And this tree, I don't know if anyone's ever seen this photograph before, but this tree has come to be referred to as Big Lonely Doug. And so this is a Douglas fir tree that was the only tree left standing in a clear cut on southern Vancouver Island. And I don't think this photograph even does justice to the size and the age of Big Lonely Doug. But this is an example of where people's emotions and values are invoked, you know, like a photograph like this. And certainly this photograph came up a lot, I think, in, you know, in relation to the blockades and the protests that later began on southern Vancouver Island in the Fairy Creek watershed in relation to clear-cut logging. So this is a little list from Renee Lertzman, who I mentioned earlier, who refers to those kind of really basic defense mechanisms about talking about climate change. And so I really like the first one, break the taboo of talking about our own experiences, check in with how you feel, and find opportunities to speak openly with your people. I'm just going to leave this up for a moment. This is just another little doodle of mine that was kind of like a bit of a summary of the stuff I was reading. And so what I was kind of imagining based on what I was reading and some of the people that I'm listening to is that if we can talk about climate change with people in our lives in a way that shares our values and our feelings and incorporates some of the stories of what we're noticing around us, some of our experiences, that it actually, I think according to some people, that it actually makes the climate crisis more immediate and it makes it more personal. And again, I wonder from a nervous system perspective, you know, again, that if we start talking about it with the people closest to us or in the everyday, that's actually safer, like that we're more regulated with people we have a relationship with, versus hearing this from authorities or being part of formal discussions. I think Jill Kubit makes a good point about whether we are talking to someone who doesn't acknowledge that it's as much of an issue as we may, that if we're connecting to values that we already hold in common, then we're in good standing to be having some conversations. So I think what I can understand from some of the experts kind of weighing in on this is that, like, we can have some of these conversations in the everyday, that it may lead to some more engagement on a bigger level. And because, you know, I'm a therapist and I work with people every day, I'm always trying to think about how to start conversations and how to ask good questions and exactly what I'm going to say. And I certainly found less of that. I found some guiding principles in terms of, like, you know, the focus on values and the focus on speaking from the heart or sharing stories. And so I was sort of thinking about, like, how would I even begin to ask some of these questions? And I had an interesting reflection on how do you feel versus what do you think? Because I think we might default to what do you think a lot. And I'm still thinking that there may be people in our lives that's the bent that we do have to take. If you know that you're dealing with someone who comes from an intellectual place, that's the way to start things off with them. But just kind of musing about, is there more room to ask people how they're feeling? I think knowing too that you may not get an immediate answer because people are pretty shut down around this. I also put, what do you notice? Just thinking about asking people what they are noticing around them in terms of effects, like, you know, whether that is heat waves or wildfires, like, or what they're noticing even in a local park or something like that. Just some of the reflections I was having about that. I started reading the book All We Can Save, and it has writings, essays, and poetry from women, Black, Indigenous people of color, women of all backgrounds that have been involved on the front lines of the climate crisis. And I had read this essay on emergent strategy by Adrienne Marie Brown. And I think her notion of emergent strategy is based on the work of Octavia Butler, who wrote a lot about how change happens. And I think for Adrienne Marie Brown, emergent strategy, she looks to nature a lot and how change occurs in nature. So I thought this quote that she had that starts off with a quote by Octavia Butler was relevant to this conversation. All that you change, all that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. We are constantly impacting and changing civilization, each other, ourselves, intimates, strangers. So in nature, everything's always changing, and yet there is no centralized government that sort of is leading all of this. The forces of nature are kind of working on each other, leading and following. And so that kind of just got me thinking about how we talk to each other in the day-to-day and the influence that we can have there. And talking is leading and listening is following. So I just kind of wanted to include that. And so I just put up a few question prompts here that I'm hoping can kind of lead us into a conversation together. I'm curious about how people have experienced climate silence. And that can be your own, and that can be when you've tried to maybe bring it up with people around you. Curious how much people find themselves wanting to talk about it or not wanting to talk about it. What stops you? Noticing even in our bodies sometimes, like what comes up when we think about having conversations about this. And just a few questions about how people imagine even having these conversations. What would they look like? How would they start? And I'm really interested to hear people's thoughts about that. So yeah, that's all I have to say. That's all I had today. So go into discussion. Yeah. stop screen sharing here.
Thank you, Monica.
Mhm.
It was quite a lot to absorb for sure. Does anybody have any kind of initial conversation, comments or? Jill, sorry, I didn't see your hand up. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So I just came back from this morning teaching yoga on the beach in Charlotte Lake. And what I'm finding just through teaching, getting people connecting to their inner nature in a safe space, in a community of like-minded people, in a beautiful space of outer nature by this beautiful elm and the loons and the quiet water, is that there's a fostering of a safe place to build relationship, both inside ourselves and outside ourselves in community. And I really think what I have experienced is if we go right into the climate change and all the gloom and doom, it just shuts people down. But if they can have a positive relationship with the natural world, and if you can gradually build that trust and help foster their appreciation of beauty and relationship with the natural world, there's sort of the ground conditions to go to the harder places. And so that's just something I'm playing with in my own work, is building the ground conditions first to have the difficult conversations.
Yeah, and I mean, yeah, I think that it's important to do that and look for places where we can do that, for sure. And I think part of me wondered about like all the ways that we can talk about this, again, knowing that it's not easy. Like, I think that if I imagine having one-on-one conversations with people in my life, I realize there might not always be this build up, although I have this opportunity to sort of choose my timing and whether we're in a state of relaxation and sort of bring this up. But and I know that sometimes, you know, if I've made reference to something that's related to climate change, or if I've talked about something that's concerned me, I may get a nod, but I may get a bit of a deer in the headlights look from the person I'm with too. And this is where all our, you know, knowledge from neurobiology that we are incorporating into psychology these days comes in, you know, that we've looked at with respect to understanding trauma and working with trauma, is that, you know, that people are sort of shutting down with this. So, you know, I try to kind of respect that and maybe move on, but still look at it that maybe it's planting seeds or maybe it's paving the way. You know, just going back to that quote from Catherine Hayhoe, like, if people aren't hearing people talk about this more than twice a year, how do we normalize that this is a thing? And obviously it's a challenge to try to normalize something at the same time that you want to make it okay, you know, normalize something that is so loaded and laden with threat for people, right? So there's nothing easy there, but it's like, in talking about this today, part of me was thinking about all the ways, all the different settings and forums that this can kind of be introduced sometimes as a way of just even trying to kind of normalize it. And I think there's, yeah, maybe some deliberate places and ways to build capacity, and other times that's not as possible, you know, to be so deliberate about it with a lot of lead in, but maybe there's still some importance in dropping seeds, you know.
I'm just going to jump in here, Monica, because building on that, what I heard from your presentation was finding common values And to me, having a conversation about common values would be one way to segue into climate conversations. For example, it's very common when people say family is most important, right? And that's a common value. And then how are families going to be in future generations? What is one way I talk to my sons about this very difficult topic. So emphasizing your common values point, I would say, would be another kind of strategy.
Yeah, I think it was, that just kind of compels me to say, I don't remember who it was, what I think it might have been Catherine Hayhoe I was listening to, who talked about, you know, there are people who obviously live in that human nature dichotomy, right? Like, I'm not an environmentalist. It's like, I care about people, people are what matter. And it's like, well, then this matters, right? You know, because obviously it's going to affect people. So she said that is a segue, right? Like, you can use that. You can use that people hold people as important and community is important, right?
Yeah. So Heather's had her hand up here.
Thank you. and so much to think about from what you shared, Monica. I took a lot of notes. Thank you for that. And you know, so relieving to have these things that we know named and be able to look at them. And I guess when I was thinking about silence, I was thinking, you know, there's a clear ways of silence where it's a silence through absence or silence because of strong defenses coming in, and so where it is very apparent. And I was starting to contemplate some of those more subtle ways of silence and silencing, and just the process of bringing them more into awareness. As I'm spending a lot of time just thinking about this from a systems change and different levels of the system and the relationships. And I guess the way that it was coming to mind is I'm an art therapist, I'm a couple and family therapist. And in both of these realms, generally there's very little talk about climate crisis in the fields, in the ways that I'm connected in them as an educator and with colleagues. Very little. There are a few people that is their interest. And then it sort of gets smaller in this other way where then I realize, oh, there's the ways that we can talk about this. A lot of people like the idea of bringing our practices outside, or maybe bringing natural materials into our practice. And sometimes that will be framed as the eco phenomena of whatever it is. And then when you sort of look at it a little bit more, that sometimes it just stops there, or sometimes it can become a bit of the paradox that in itself it becomes a bit extractivist or taking from and not really thinking about how it relates to the bigger story. And so it becomes a silencing where it starts from this place of opening. I don't know if it makes very much sense the way I'm explaining it, but just sort of these unspoken rules about what gets spoken about, how it's spoken about, when, and that sometimes in that niching or the parameters that limits some of the harder, more important conversations.
I just wanted to throw something in here from where I live, which is on coastal California. And the sort of cynical thought that came to my mind is just wait, because I remember having all these thoughts before disaster became a normal part of our life here. It doesn't seem anymore that we have climate silence. It feels like everyone all the time is aware, and we're getting re-traumatized. Like right now, we're going into our hot, dry season. Everybody in California there's nobody who's not aware. I really don't think, because it's right there on the surface. And when you talk to friends, I just had a big conversation this morning about how people are putting solar on their roofs, how we're going to deal with electricity that's going to go off this summer. Are we getting a heat pump? Are we getting air conditioning? I mean, what are we doing? It's no longer climate change, it's climate disaster. And that's, I believe, how people feel about it here. And I think as conditions continue to worsen, which unfortunately they will, I mean, we're certainly not the only place on the planet that's living with this daily sword of Damocles over our heads. It's happening in so many places. I think it really shifts the conversation in ways that maybe we can't do just by talking to people, even with our best intentions. And I also really resonated with what you said about therapists, because I think therapists are the worst offenders. I mean, the reductionism that goes on, this is really about smog. I mean, Joanna Macy has talked about people saying this to her therapists when she, of course, is this great pioneer in our field, was telling people about her grief for the world. It was basically, oh, what does this have to do with your family of origin or your traumas in childhood? It's like, what is wrong with us as therapists? That we're so, I guess we just have our little narrow way of seeing the world, to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. It's just unbelievable. I actually think the general public is more aware of all this stuff than many therapists are, which is part of the reason why I really like teaching this stuff to other therapists, because I think we've got to wake up and understand what really is happening and what people really are feeling. And I was thinking about the issue of couples, and I'm a marriage and family therapist too. It's like the whole issue is about not having children. It's like, hello, that's become a big issue. And I've also seen issues where people come in and say, what do I do with my partner? My partner doesn't get it. And Carolyn Baker, who I know that Carol's going to be bringing on in September, she's written a whole book about this, about how collapse is affecting marriage and family and other relationships. So, wow, this couldn't be a more important topic. Thank you for bringing it up, Monica.